Hello, this is JFL, John Francis Leader, and you're very welcome to the Body, Mind, Self podcast. So I'm here today with Dr. Andrew Pringle. Andrew, you're very welcome to the Body, Mind, Self podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, John. It's great to be here. Talk to you.
So for those of you those of our listeners who don't know who you are or what you do, who are you? How would you describe what you do in some shape or form?
Right. It's a good question because sometimes I tell people I'm a psychologist. Now, that's not technically quite right because I'm a cognitive psychologist. And I think that difference is important to stress. So by cognitive psychology, we mean really trying to understand how the mind works, essentially. And trying to understand kind of normal human behavior on generally. So things like, how people's attention works, people's memory. Obviously we look at how these things break down in conditions like, Alzheimer's and amnesia, these types of things. But it's really a cognitive psychology, which I do, is really a basic understanding of how the mind works and a normal kind of cognitive kind of human thinking processes, if you like. So,
and it's an important point, isn't it? Because that word psychologist, there may be some pictures that come to mind for the average person, but there's a lot of scope under that, isn't there?
Yeah, I always, when I first studied undergraduate, that I'd have my couch by now, and people would be sitting on it in some room with some flowers, with a beautiful view over a park and stuff. But the psychology is such a wide discipline with so many different kind of people doing such different things in that area. So you have it goes from the extent of sort of forensic psychology, where people are looking at aspects of the criminal justice system, how the police can interview people so that that suspects are not kind of forced into, say, making confessions for crimes that they didn't commit. So sort of psychological vulnerabilities which might be there and might account for I'd say at all points in sort of the criminal justice system. So you've got the forensic side of things, right to the kind of more cognitive side of things that I do. Really looking at kind of behavior, often doing sort of experiments in laboratories with human subjects, human participants, but really looking at very small differences in cognitive processes. So just to kind of give an example of that, how we process, for example, how processes such as color naming and word reading kind of conflict. So it's a common task called the Stroop task, which is often used sort of as a measure of inhibition. And not to go into too much detail, but essentially that task looks at sort of the competition between we see a color and we're asked to read the color that word's written in, and if, say, it's a color if the word red is printed in the color green, and we're asked to tell the color of that word, the written information gets in the way of our color naming.
By the way, I'm going to put a link to a Stroop test in the description. Okay,
okay.
So anybody who's listening, check it out, because it is one of these things. It's fun to experience, isn't it?
It is,
because there is in psychology, isn't it? These things we think we know better, but then we see kind of the limits or the idiosyncrasies of a perceptual system only when we really test it.
That's right, John. Absolutely, and I think there's some good tasks. Stroop task being one great task that you can just have a go at home. There's lots of sort of examples of it on the web, and you can just experience that kind of conflict between those kind of two processes of naming the color and reading the color yourself. There's also a good example is perceptual illusions as well.
Yes.
Now these are great kind of ways to sort of, I think, really understand, really appreciate the intricacies of the how the human mind is actually built, and the fact that the world that we kind of think we see is sometimes not the world that is really kind of out there, and our brain is kind of filling in the dots, and it doesn't provide our brain doesn't provide a full representation of the external world. it only provides a representation of the world which is useful to us. So that may change based on the context we're in. And that's kind of where perceptual illusions kind of come from, this fact that we're not getting a full view of reality. We're kind of, the brain is interpreting reality for our purposes. And that makes good sense from an evolutionary perspective, because there would be, otherwise we'd experience, we'd experience a massive overload. We'd just be crippled by the amount of information we were having to process. So it really makes sense to process the information which is most important to us, hence why kind of emotional stimuli like faces, for example, are such kind of alluring objects to look at. We see faces in everything. We see faces in rocks and kind of toast, as in Jesus.
You
in
mean
the
that
toast.
wasn't Jesus this morning?
Well,
I had assumed.
I know, absolutely.
I thought I was special.
Obviously, there's another angle on that, but I think from a perspective of a cognitive psychologist, yes, it's quite nice to sort of see how these things kind of are
patterns,
are just facets of our brain. Faces are so important for us to recognize.
Yeah, completely. And what comes to mind is that this is what a lot of technology is trying to solve. And I mean, even not that Google in its original manifestation as a search engine was simple, but simpler than what we're seeing happening nowadays as that advances in AI and deep learning and deep action and all of these kinds of things. But that ability, when you were talking about the sheer volume of information coming in, the ability to be able to do something with that, to coherently sort it in some way, that's what that is, isn't it? Because there's no shortage of information in the world, but how do we filter it in some way, in a way that's based on what matters?
Absolutely. Like, I mean, I think this is the, we live in this kind of strange paradox, essentially, in these times of having, all the information that we can need at our fingertips, just a Google search away, essentially. But, how do you actually distill that information into something useful for what we need to do, what actions we need to perform? And I think, it's really, it used to be back in sort of previous times that it was all about knowledge, and education, for example, was about gaining knowledge. Sorry, John. But now it's much more about actually being able to use this knowledge in effective ways. And I think that's a problem which is incredibly important and ubiquitous across kind of all fields. But it's something which is difficult to solve. And I think we are still, trying to work out how to harness this incredible kind of web of information we have out there to actually help us with our lives, rather than hinder us with too much choice, which is sometimes
drown us in information.
What we all feel
at best. Yeah,
absolutely.
And what you're saying there, I think, kind of beautifully paints a picture of, I suppose, what psychology and what psychologists can be doing, can be focusing on, because, again, not to some listeners, but to a lot of people, when the word psychology or psychologist comes up, again, there's going to be a notion of maybe a therapeutic application of it. There's going to be, I suppose, nowadays also a CSI picture as well comes to mind of some sort of forensic psychologist out there analyzing in that way. But I suppose psychology is so implicit by definition in everything that we're doing, and whether it's these technological applications or really whether it's anything else, that's the case. And I kind of feel we've been pretty bad at that sometimes and I think of the example of the optical illusions and Stroop tests and things like that as being very good examples of how we need to get this stuff out there, actually show it to people, get people thinking about things a bit differently, and it shouldn't be this thing that's behind closed doors in labs. It's so unnecessary for that to be the case. Hopefully technology is going some way to solving that, because now there's a sort of a need, and people are saying, well, how does this stuff work, and how do we make sense of it?
Yes.
What do you see that is happening or could happen there?
Yeah, I think I think the important thing, as I was talking to an environmental psychologist recently. Now, as by environmental psychologist, I mean this is a lecturer in University of Surrey in the UK, and her kind of role in environmental psychology is trying to get people to engage in more pro-environmental behavior, so to recycle more, to save more energy. Now, she was working with some computer scientists, and they developed this kind of really cool kind of device for. It's quite a few years ago now, for monitoring energy levels and kind of off plug supplies for various devices. You know, so it was kind of, and in that time, sort of fairly new, this type of technology. Anyway, they presented this technology to her and installed it in sort of various offices in the university, and they just sort of said, well, here's the technology. That's the problem solved.
Yeah.
But, you know, she was very much like, well, you know, you need to, how do you get people to actually take up that technology and actually use that technology? How do you get people to be motivated to use it?
Right.
How do you actually test if the technology is actually, you know, helping them or, you know, hindering them? I mean, you know, at first sight, it feels that, you know, energy saving technology is going to help people realize their kind of energy saving goals. But, you know, maybe maybe it's just too complex kind of, if you've got to kind of, you know, go to the, you know, reach under your monitor every day, you're under your desktop computer as it was back in the day, and root around for a button to switch, you know, to sort of, you know, how do you operate the controllers for these things? You know, there's various kind of human processes which go on to actually, which are important to consider for this technology to actually work. So I think, you know, psychology research and the related area of human-computer interaction, which I think is a growing and very important area, is to really kind of evaluate and examine and see how we can support human use of technologies, so that, you know, the technologies are fantastic, and I think sometimes the interaction, kind of the human interaction with them, that element is sometimes lost in the sort of excitement of the technology. I mean, that's kind of where psychologists and HCI, human-computer interaction researchers, come in. I think we have that kind of focus on, you know, how do the humans, you know, how are people gonna use these things? And I think that's something which is kind of growing in realization in the human-computer interaction community. I should say that community is made up of, you know, computer scientists as well, who build all these cool, you know, brilliant software for doing things like saving energy, and they've got, you know, there's great ideas there. But I think, you know, almost in the design of these things, you have to kind of think of the human being using it from day one to make it effective. Yeah,
there is a very real need for a kind of a cognitive ergonomics in the design process. It's probably something like a furniture designer who's just a carpenter and doesn't ever interact with people. Is it? And, you know, the technology's there, the building's there, the skill is there in probably a way that a psychologist wouldn't have. Somebody who really understood people but not furniture, you know, would struggle to create a good sofa.
Yeah. Yes,
but, you know, there's something in the middle there that's needed.
Yes.
It's the old question of, you know, whether the juice carton's designed to fit the fridge, or was the fridge designed to fit the juice carton in that way? And, you know, there's probably some interplay between the two on some level in the development.
Yeah. I think that's right, John. I mean, I think it's so important, you know, in people to work in a kind of interdisciplinary fashion, you know. So, I mean, I think the simple, like, rather than getting sort of those complex sort of terminologies about how people work together, but it's about kind of, as you say, the person who builds the thing, the designer, the carpenter, interacting with the person who's thinking of the human element from day one, and that design process. And I think, you know, really, if you look at kind of there's some good sort of thinking at Stanford University on something called design thinking at the moment, which is really about kind of how we can design better for human needs, to actually make it so that the things we're designing actually work for people, rather than just sort of, you know, perform the function of what we think it should perform. Because sometimes we don't know how people are really going to use this thing, you know, unless we really go out into the world and observe that sort of behavior. And that's really the thinking behind a group in Stanford called IDEO, and I think it's David Kelly, if you want to track down the name.
Good,
Is that familiar to you?
Yeah, I'm not directly familiar with it.
No, okay.
Yeah,
I mean, the sort of ballpark with the name.
We'll put some links in the footnotes.
So that's called design thinking, and I think it's kind of, you know, taken the business world kind of by storm. So it's kind of come from obviously industrial design, designing things like shopping trolleys, for example. You know, sometimes even really mundane things like this, we've just got used to a certain design for these things. But, you know, that doesn't mean to say it's the best. You know, it's the best design out there. You know, I always think of the example of the hand dryer. You know, the classic, you know, white hand dryer with the small little kind of air vent, which sort of blows on you and never ever like, you know, dries your hands. And, you know, I never thought anything about this. I just thought this is what hand dryers were supposed to be. And then I saw the Dyson, you know, not to kind of sell the Dyson product here, but I think the Dyson hand dryer is a really good example of, you know, good design of a kind of ubiquitous appliance, which really actually solved the problem. Which and sometimes that problem wasn't even known about. You know, that problem never crossed my mind until I saw the solution, and I thought, that's genius. You know, and I think that's what design thinking allows you to unpick. You know, sort of really unpick. Does that piece of technology is that really working? You know, well for people. You know, are we just used to it? Rather than it actually being particularly good at what it does. So there's a link to be made with AR here. I don't know if you want me to go into augmented reality at this point.
Yeah. Well, let's do that.
Am I jumping the gun? Okay.
I don't think we can jump the gun with that, because that's a very, very relevant topic.
Okay.
But before you get there, where have you come from to get there?
Sure.
Because I think you've given us a very good sense of what you're interested in there, painted some of the pictures of it. To begin with, though, what got you into psychology even to begin with, and then why specifically cognitive psychology, and then beyond that, what have you actually been doing up until this point? Yeah,
that's a good question, John. And what got me into psychology? Well, I can tell you seeing one kind of perceptual illusion was what kind of hooked me into doing a psychology degree, and it's called and this is the name of the research paper if anyone wants to track it down: Gorillas in Our Midst, not to be confused with the nature documentary Gorillas in the Mist by Diane Fossey. This is basically a psychology experiment with a group of people throwing a beach ball around between them. So just a group of students throwing a beach ball between them, and you're asked. So I was asked by the professor of psychology. I went to a talk at Edinburgh University. Basically, I was interested in enrolling there on their undergraduate psychology program, and I went to this talk, and he showed this video, and he said, you know, just focus on this group of people, focus on the ball being thrown around. And then, so he showed that, and then at the end, he asked if he'd seen anything strange during that kind of presentation, during the people throwing the ball around. Now, some people in the room put their hand up. I wasn't one of them, but he basically said, "Did you notice the gorilla in the middle of the group wandering around?" So a person in the gorilla outfit wandering around, waving their hands in the middle of the group. You know, you'd think, how could I not see that? But most of the room didn't see it, and he sort of played it back, and you said, "Don't focus on the ball this time," and eventually, you know, if you're not focusing on the ball, you see the gorilla. And the idea is this, as I was saying earlier, this kind of, if you are focusing, you know, you're kind of on the movement of, say, a certain object in space, you will. There's a good chance you will miss something, you know, coming up in that space, which is even as obvious as a gorilla waving its arms around, or a man dressed in a gorilla suit waving his arms around. And it really shows you, again, that we only have the view of the world which is useful for us for the task we're performing. So, I mean, in that task, I think it was actually, you had to count the number of times the ball was thrown between people. So it was a fairly demanding, task. You had to actually pay a lot of attention to that, where that ball was going. And that's the phenomenon it's showing is something called change blindness. There's another good study where it's someone takes a big, I think it's a mirror or something like that, a big kind of rectangular object. Anyway, they're going towards no, sorry, I'll start again with that. There's a better example. So you go to a desk, for example, some sort of form filling, it's a doctor's surgery, for example, and you go to the desk and you're asked to fill out a form, for example, by the receptionist. And then halfway through, when you're filling out that form, the receptionist they swap places with someone else who's been hiding behind that desk next to the receptionist, but so you couldn't see them. So the receptionist is changes. So if it's say obviously it wouldn't be a change from a man and a woman, but two men who look relatively similar, but by far definitely not sort of in any way identical.
Yeah.
And you find that on most of the time, people never notice that change in the receptionist. That's because they haven't been paying attention to the receptionist. You know, the receptionist is there. Mm-hmm. Obviously, they're performing a role, but you're, as the person who's filling out the form, you're focused on, you know, the form you're filling out, you know, what you're there to do. You're not focused on that person. So they've not kind of grabbed your attention. And that just shows you, again, that we're not processing the whole world that's in front of our eyes, which is, and it's this phenomenon called change blindness. And that really drew me in. And I think that's also why I got interested in cognitive psychology, because I think at the beginning I was interested in psychology for the clinical reasons. You know, I think it's absolutely fascinating, you know, to try and understand conditions obviously like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. You know, there's some really interesting cognitive psychological research on those topics. Yeah. But I think, you know, it's actually equally interesting to understand how our everyday perceptual systems work, you know, and which applies to kind of everyone. And I think this phenomena of illusions, perceptual illusions, is a good way to really kind of appreciate the magic of how you know we work as people. And I think that's that kind of took me away from the the clinical applications of psychology into sort of more trying to understand you know, just how our mind works, as I said before.
Yes, and that's important, isn't it? Yeah. Because there actually, at a certain level, isn't a clear line on what is clinical and what isn't there. There's certain things you could do very much removed from the therapy room or the clinic that could be very, very critically important in the clinic or the therapy room or just in the life of the average person. And that's important, I think, to see that it's not that clear a divide. Absolutely. I think that's a very good, you know, that's an absolutely brilliantly important point, you know, crucially important point you make there, John, because that dividing line, I think, is something which the more you study psychology, the more you see that that's in somewhat kind of a, you know, not a false dichotomy. Yeah. So, I mean, that you know, clinical symptoms are, you know, we all kind of, a lot of these, you know, personality and traits, and, you know, the extent to which people have certain tendencies that's kind of, you know, maybe clinically diagnosed as sort of, you know, mania, for example, are often kind of on a spectrum. Right. Right. There's I mean, this is not my kind of area of speciality, but if anyone's interested, I'm reading a really good book about it at the moment, sort of a general psychology book called Understanding Madness, which I can give the reference to this. Yeah, we'll link to that.
This is a really, I mean, if you're interested in that sort of side of psychology, and as I say, it sort of talks about some of the mental disorders from a sort of a very specific kind of how they're rooted in the normal processes of the mind, I think, which is fascinating. It really kind of actually really humanizes, you know, madness. I mean, essentially. You're absolutely right, and that point of how we make sense of things is critically important, because even in what may seem from one perspective to be disorder, it can surprisingly make a huge amount of sense within itself, isn't it? There can be an internal consistency within it sometimes, or, as is classically the case, the misuse of a feature, in a sense that we have. Something that's very close to me, because a lot of what I work with in my therapeutic work, that part of my work is with stress and anxiety and other adrenaline-related difficulties. And I think it's just so clear to see when you explore that the adrenal system is really a fabulous system. Yeah. But it's a sort of a system that we don't quite need in the way we used to use it, maybe. Yes. I mean, that's not true of all people in all parts of the world. And of course, if we have a fire, it's also not true there. Then it suddenly is fabulous again. Absolutely. But a lot of the time, we're just using it in ways we don't need to, where we're kind of overbuilding it. Yes. How interesting it is with that example that it's a physical system, the adrenal glands in the center of the body, the neurological processes that are part of it. But as a system, it's almost primarily triggered by imagination. It's not the lion or the tiger
sinking its teeth into you that gives you an adrenaline rush. It's the idea of what may happen. So
Absolutely.
it's this cognitive aspect to it.
Yeah.
So I think you're right, because it's easy to pathologize, I suppose, and that's another thing people may negatively think of when they think of psychologists sometimes, or problems or mental disorders or difficulties. But I think there's a huge amount, and there's a lot happening, isn't there, in that space, in really normalizing these things and saying, let's actually understand this from the ground up. What is it trying to achieve as a system? And let's appreciate that more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the most exciting things for me about psychology. It's just trying to, you're really trying to understand these phenomena. You're trying to strip away kind of our kind of preconceptions about these things, and it's really a great, it's a great subject for busting the myths we have about kind of our own human experience, which I think, I would be a firm believer in the fact that kind of our human experience, and which I think psychology is all about, human behavior, the study of human behavior and the mind, are the kind of the most important and most interesting questions that humanity faces. I think, it's among for a lot of people doing psychology, I think that's why they got into it. That kind of understanding and interest in the human element. That's what sort of took me into psychology, and say, I was more interested in that element than, say, in chemistry or physics, which is, I guess, less of that kind of human element, kind of trying to understand human behavior and stuff in that.
So it's a huge topic area, and what has your research up until this point? Where has it really taken you, and why? Where have you found yourself zooming in on within what we've just discussed?
So I should probably say, like, my PhD is in the subject of human creativity. So and I would say the psychology of human creativity. So by that I mean, how our normal thinking processes allow us to be creative. Mm-hmm. So I think, and I really came through that from the sort of what I was talking about before, the interest in cognitive psychology, just understanding normal human thinking processes. So I think there's a lot of ideas about creativity being kind of this magical thing, which comes from a bolt of lightning. Sun strikes you, when you're in the shower or in the bath, and you suddenly get up and run around the street shouting "Eureka, Eureka!" But it's really the study of sort of creativity shows that and how people are able to be creative, and how creative people kind of work, shows that it's much more complex than that. And this idea of kind of being hit by a bolt out of the blue is there's some kind of evidence to suggest unconscious processing in creativity, but it's just not the whole story. And as with a lot of these psychological phenomena, it's really there's a lot of kind of creative people are often, you can be creative in many different ways. So, and often creative people are paradoxes within themselves. So by that I mean, the creative person is often described as more mad, and at the same time more sane than someone who is say not working in a creative profession. But I mean, I would say that, but someone like Salvador Dali, or let's not just think of artists, is what I'm trying to say to myself. Because Albert Einstein, someone who came up with a theory like this, in science, it's very important to understand that creativity is a big part of what scientists do in this ability to kind of really kind of develop a whole new kind of paradigm, as say Einstein did with his theory of relativity. And
how should we use a word like creativity? Because I think it has been pigeonholed to some degree in an artistic sense, and that's of course a very important type of creativity, or a use of creativity. But as you say, it's far beyond that, and I certainly know from working with all kinds of different people that sometimes they'll leave me a bit of a backlash to the word creative. That's seen as actually a negative thing. No, I'm a rational person. I'm an effective person. It almost has a negative connotation sometimes, which certainly to me seems unusual for the reasons you've mentioned. That, as I say, in an Einsteinian sense, we would want to bring that in, but it's not that it's this kind of unbounded, kind of emotional kind of exploration.
No. I mean, I think like it's a very good point. I think there is creativity. I think it's fair to say that people associate it more with the arts than the sciences. Now I think people use sometimes different terms in science. Like innovation compared to, creativity is used in the arts, innovation used in sort of science and engineering. Now, I think you could have a lot of debates of, sort of semantics of what those words mean. But I think it's important to kind of, my view is we need to sort of actually think of creativity as happening across the board. People can be obviously creativity exists in I would be the first as a creativity researcher to also say, it's in the arts, it's in the kind of performative arts, all different kind of artistic domains, but it's also in science, it's also in engineering. People have to work out, whenever you have to work out a novel solution to a problem that actually has utility or adds value. I think that's kind of that brings us to kind of my definition of creativity, which is not kind of my personal definition, but it's the kind of what's been it's been come to by sort of many different scholars in kind of the field of creativity research. And I think there's general agreement now that creativity really involves these two processes. So the first process being finding something which is novel, generating a novel idea, and the second is kind of evaluating that idea for say its appropriateness, its utility, say in engineering, where it has to work. You have to use something like the Dyson hand dryer I mentioned. It has to actually dry your hands. It can't just look chic and cool. Has to do the job. And I think that kind of that kind of utility can be. It also does exist in the artistic domain, in that you have to have a painting, for example, which gives the viewer some kind of value in looking at it, for example. So when you go to an art museum, it's not just that you see these novel kind of exhibits. They also have to be of value to some people. Now there might be obviously there's a lot of kind of some people might find artistic work of value. Other people might think it's absolute garbage. Yeah. But I think that's okay. There's a sort of differential across people there, where certain people enjoy different things, and that's great. That's what experience is. But it's kind of has to have some value to the observer, really. Yeah. And I think all artistic works of recognized kind of by the peers in their field. Kind of have that, and I think that's another. We're trying to sort of work out, what's a creative painting versus a non-creative painting. Well, to a certain extent, that's really decided by the experts in a field. So, if you've got people hanging your work in art galleries, well, then it's safe to say that there's people in that field who think it's creative. Yes. Otherwise it wouldn't be there. We don't tend to see, children's artwork as inverted commas creative as it is, the pink sheep. We don't see those things as hanging in art galleries. Now, I think obviously it's important to kind of say there that I wouldn't be attacking children for not producing creative work, because if I saw a child producing a pink sheep, I'm sure I'd be the first to say that's really interesting, that's creative, and it is, because for them it's different. If they haven't seen a pink sheep before and they draw a pink sheep, in their nursery class or something, then they've created something new for themselves. And I think it's also important to see there's different levels of creativity there. So I was really previously talking about eminent creativity which makes a contribution to society at large. But there's people have talked about lower kind of creativity of a different kind of order of magnitude. Light's just gone off. Let's try and get that back on.
It's a motion sensor, is it?
So yes,
There's
it's a motion sensor.
Point to be made there.
Wasn't moving fast enough. So got a chance to wave at the camera anyway. So so people have called the sort of creativity of children mini C creativity. It's not to value it less. It's just to say that it's of a different kind of type. It's still creativity, but you can't put eminent creativity and mini C children's creativity side by side. That creativity is evident for the child. So it's of value in its kind of it's valuable to the child in the sense that they've never come up with that before. So it's sort of they're engaging in that creative kind of process.
So when you start talking about the outputs of creativity, it gets interesting, isn't it? Because there's some creative work which in a very clear sense would seem to have utility. So some of the industrial design examples you're mentioning there are, precisely speaking to that. You're designing this thing, it's creative, it's innovative in some sense, it does something, there's some output to it, it's solved a problem, it's novel, etc. Other work, of course, could seek to have some output like that but not achieve it, but still would have been creative in some use of the word, in the sense that there certainly would have been innovative thinking happening around it, but wouldn't have reached its target in that sense. And then, of course, I'm also thinking as well of kind of blue skies research and this kind of very, very creative exploration, whether it's in the cosmos or whether it's on the nano level or whether it's just here on Earth, and a kind of middle range sense that actually has no goal at all in mind, and then it achieves apparently nothing, but then 5 years later it turns out to be critically important in a particular field, or 100 years later it turns out to be. So in that sense, it seems complicated to try and bound it in one shape or form, and even that child's work as well, could be the start of something big that's to come, and it could be a kind of a generative process over time as well. It seems a difficult thing to try and unpack in that way.
It is. I mean, I think. So here's another interesting way maybe to think of creativity. I think there's. While I said that most scholars in the field kind of define it in that sort of, it's about generating ideas and then evaluating them, so that generating novel ideas, which you then evaluate to make sure they have utility in the sense of, as I said, being functional in the case of the Dyson hand dryer, or being of value in the case of the painting. You go to see the art gallery and you get an experience from that. I think there's another way to kind of look at creativity, which maybe better encompasses some of the things you were saying there, John, because those are important points. I absolutely agree with you there. And that's that it's an interesting idea that creativity is kind of the by engaging in the creative process, we change our own view of the world.
Right.
And that actually the creativity is really our view of the world changing. And that's the most important thing. The stuff we produce at the end of it is kind of, mere excrement, if you like, from that process. Now, obviously that excrement can be pretty valuable, and I think people are not there trying to change their worldview. They're trying to create the next, they're trying to create the Apple Mac, the next big social media kind of platform. But I think in the process of doing that, people's view of the world completely changes.
Right.
And I think that's the important thing about any sort of, if you like, creative exercise we engage in, where we try and create something new, is that inevitably, that journey, it will change us.
Yes.
And I think that's a very nice way, and I think valuable way of looking at creativity. I mean, and it's as they kind of hammer home to you in education, and I think this kind of matters for all of us, no matter what age we're. What we do, and the fact that changes us, that's human growth, and that's always gonna mean that as humans we will go to new places.
I'm thinking of Vygotsky with Signs and Tools. I'm thinking of Piaget and equilibration, and again it's a kind of a process, isn't it, rather than an individual act very often. The sense of shaping the world and being shaped by it, and
absolutely
in equilibration, this balancing between this kind of unbridled creativity, and that seems to be one of the great things about creativity and about the functions of the mind in many ways, is it truly can go anywhere. It seems potentially very unbounded, which is both its strength and its weakness in some respects, because grounding that seems to be key. But then on the other extreme, this very concrete sense of the world, which has great benefits to it, because there's something more constant to it, but it could be limiting as well if we were overly concrete. So there seems to be something in this coming together of this great creativity and also this acceptance of the world as it is, and the mixing together in the middle. A thought experiment around that is, if you have, let's say, two inventors, and one is by all accounts a genius. They just are innovative, they're visionary, they're able to see ahead and really predict future trends, but that's where it stays. It's a world of ideas, and it never gets kind of equilibrated in that way and brought into the world. And then if you imagine another person who's not that great. They're boring ideas. They're a little bit limiting. Maybe they are actually very tacky as an inventor. They'll literally stick a clock on something. They really aren't that good.
Yeah.
But they do something. But they're very active in what they do, and they get it out there.
Yeah.
And it does still maybe affect a few people a little bit. And even it might just affect people in the way that they go, this is ridiculous, I can do better. And then they become creative. And it's interesting because at the end of both of these people's careers, that worst person, by all accounts, will have achieved so much more in the world than that other person. Could you say a bit about that? I'm interested in that sense of the application and that equilibration, how that comes into play.
That's a great thought kind of experiment there, John. I mean, I think that it's there, and I would agree. There are people like that. Kind of, there is this sort of dichotomy between. There are a lot of people out there who are great at producing ideas, but really not good at translating them into real tangible things. Be that products or research papers or something which just is living for posterity. It survives past them uttering the words to someone.
Exactly.
So I think there is this kind of view. One view, for example, I'll go through a couple of different views. One view is that creative people are actually good at doing both those things. So they are able to they're able to operate in this kind of mindset of just, sort of a playful kind of mindset, if you like, where they're able to sort of just kind of freely associate and generate ideas. And then, they're able to then switch to a different mindset, which is about like actually getting these ideas, done and actually putting them down on paper or doing the very kind of like, if you like, boring kind of steps of actually working out the workability of these ideas and going through all those sorts of issues like, well, it doesn't quite work this way, we need to sort of just and you need to reframe things slightly like this. So you're going through this sort of constant cycle of, maybe you've got the big idea, but then you're having to sort of generate and evaluate iteratively over many different cycles. And that process can be, that's hard work and it involves perseverance. Yeah. And I think, while certain people are really good at kind of coming up with those ideas, I think people who truly make a creative contribution to the world, and I refer back here to the eminent creators like Dali or Einstein. It's not all inspiration. There's a lot of perspiration there. That kind of 99% perspiration is what it takes for creative ideas to be realized. I think it was maybe Edison who said that. Right. Is very true, and is supported by the research as well. You have to, and essentially that was what my PhD subtopic was on, this ability of creative people to switch between these different modes of thinking, if you like. So the mode where you can generate ideas freely, and the mode where you can kind of analyze these ideas and sort of make them, put them to work.
Building on exactly that, do we wrongly separate what we could roughly call perception and action in I'm thinking in a kind of a John Dewey type sense in the way that we talk about this, because using Edison as an example and the famous thousands of attempts at inventing the light bulb, but they were all prototypes in his view. Essentially, there wasn't one failure in any of them. Using that kind of point of view, there is a sense in which we can sit down and think creatively in some respect, and there's another sense in which we can, I suppose, lack creativity in some sense, but literally just keep iterating enough times. Yeah. And of course, this is what computer technology might be able to do for us. Well, so, that type of a system, whether it's a human or whether it's a computer, just through pure trial and error and the numbers, it gets to a destination. Is that creativity?
Well, again, a good question. I mean, I think... for example, there is kind of research which has looked at the creativity of computers, and can computers produce, say, artworks which are judged as creative as humans? Yeah. And the sort of initial evidence suggests that yes. I mean, from a point of view, you can actually get computers to produce artwork which top artists, eminent artists who are judging it can't tell the difference. Which is kind of spooks, I think, people out a little bit. The question is, does that say a lot for computers and not very much for certain mainstream artists? Yeah, I mean, I think possibly. I think there's while that maybe shows the sort of a computer can, I think, go through this kind of iterative process. And there's, computer scientists have done some clever things, like actually, you actually assess how good the idea is based on sort of an algorithm, which sort of, the human has to enter into the system what makes a good painting. And I think that's, but if the computer knows that, if it knows what sort of elements make a good painting, well, it can sort of try and meet those objectives.
Right.
I think that does tell you where a computer sort of fails, and a human, a human can make up their own objectives.
Yeah.
And I think that's, if a computer can maybe reproduce a Monet or something, but can a computer become the next Monet or the next great artist? I don't think computers are at that stage. AI is at that stage yet, where computers can actually go beyond what they're instructed to do. Now I'm not an expert in that area, but like I think that kind of, you have someone who comes along and changes the paradigm.
Yes, yeah.
A human being, and I think that's something which computers can't do.
And this takes us towards the augmentation, doesn't it? Because of course that word can be used in many different ways, and please feel free to introduce it for those who aren't familiar with it as a term. But certainly we have, and we always have, used technologies in one form or another to support us in what we do.
Yeah.
David Krakauer and the Santa Fe Institute is a useful, it's a distinction made in a few different ways by a number of theorists, but between complementary and competitive cognitive artifacts. And it's a very helpful, kind of straightforward distinction in some ways, because the idea is that some of them are complementary to us and others are competitive, meaning that if we don't have them anymore, we're screwed essentially. So something like a calculator is a good example, because if you have your calculator, it really helps you. You need a human and a calculator together to get good work done.
Yes,
the moment your calculator is gone, you're in trouble. You don't have that mathematical capacity. The example he uses is something like an abacus, on the other hand, which apparently is internalized, the research shows, in that expert abacus users don't need an abacus anymore.
Right, okay.
They actually internalize that capacity.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing as well, isn't it, and how we're using those tools. And there's an interesting point in creativity there too, because of course if you're doing your research and you're getting Google up, and then you're offloading some of that. So the iterative work we were talking about before can be done in conjunction with human creativity, and you get something very interesting as you blend them. Yeah.
And I think there is kind of some work, again, not massively familiar with it, but sort of blending those two different things together. And I think, for me, that's sort of where the future should go. Right. I think just maybe to kind of define augmented reality here.
Please,
I think you've defined, you've sort of touched on it very well there. But it's really kind of the overlaying of digital and virtual information onto physical objects in the real world. Now, I'm sort of, often it's kind of being talked about recently, kind of in the media, sort of a visual thing. Sure. But it could also be like a kind of, any kind of information which augments the ability of humans to perform actions. Yes. And I think that could be in different kind of sensory channels as well. It could be in hearing, for example, as well. And I think it's kind of been going on for a long time. But I think from again coming back to that sort of putting the human into this. Augmented reality is great from the point of view is that it involves humans. It keeps humans in that in the process. Humans are essential for the tasks which augmented reality, right. You're augmenting the human capacity to perform tasks, and rather than opposed to kind of automation, which is really taking the human out of the task. Right. And I think it's not surprising that, for me, the idea of having AI which produces the discoveries of the future while we just kick back and watch TV or it doesn't strike me as a sort of I don't really think that's a good place for humanity to be going to. That's not really the direction.
Well, these are competitive cognitive artifacts, and this leads to this kind of Wall-E type example of again humans just dwindling, isn't it, essentially, because like what's happened to muscle tone in so many respects because of certain technologies, and the fact we don't need to go out and farm and climb trees and do all of that is similar cognitive potential risk is there, or not, isn't it, depending on how we play it.
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's very important. I think the kind of augmented reality is an augmenting human sensory abilities, essentially, is what I mean by that, is so important, because it means that we're always going to be at the center of this process. So we don't cut ourselves out of things like we might do in kind of, the things you were talking about, John, and automotive processes. So, for example, in car manufacturing, or any sort of manufacturing, there's always a human who's being augmented in some way, potentially with some sort of eyewear kind of head-mounted display, where they're being shown where they should, the sequence in which they should assemble parts of the car. Think about your IKEA furniture, for example. Imagine this is one of the nice examples of augmented reality. It can show you the sequence within which you should build your furniture, but right in front of your eyes. So you don't need to look at the manual. You don't need to keep looking back and forth to the manual. And it shows you sort of where the nuts and bolts need to go, in that kind of sequence. So you've got that kind of, it's essentially the augmented reality is taking the cognitive load away from you. The kind of, essentially quite a boring task of having to refer to a manual. Probably a lot of people enjoy the building processes. I enjoy the building process myself of IKEA furniture, but the part of like referring back to the manual and stuff is a bit kind of, it's a bit sort of, tiring at times.
It does, but it's a very important point. It's a good example of that, because it just interrupts the workflow, if nothing else.
Absolutely,
and it's interesting, isn't it? Because why should it? Because the content that you're seeking on the bit of paper is directly related to the task you're performing.
Yeah.
So it's clearly not the content that's disruptive. That's not. It's not like a phone ringing. It's not distractive in that sense.
Yeah.
What the problem is an ergonomics problem. Again, isn't it, to be solved? So some way in which that data can be available easily, and what comes to mind when I think of different types of augmentation as well are just displays in cars and things like that, and the idea of heads-up displays. So which makes such eminent sense that to see what speed you're going, you don't have to look away from where you're driving to, isn't it? Like in a car of all things. So that's just as true in IKEA as it is on the road and so many other places.
Absolutely,
simple things.
Simple things. I mean, I think it might be the case we look back 50 years from now, for example. I mean, that seems a realistic time frame. Probably happen even quicker than that. Look back at the fact what we're doing is we're reading from manuals to operate devices. We're on these rectangles all the time. We live life in rectangles, and this point has been made by Meron Grabetz, who's a CEO of Meta, who's a kind of company in the augmented reality sector, and he puts it really well. When we're doing any activity, these days on kind of any device, computer, smartphone, tablet, you're always hunched over, kind of fumbling through kind of screens, on these sort of rectangles, and it's just we might look at that as crazy as people in the past. Taking airships or something when they could have flown, when we can fly now. We might look at this as or kind of videos compared to ghetto blasters, compared to kind of the music devices we listen to now. We just kind of not believe that people used to do that, and I think that's when you start to think of things that way. It's one of the most powerful kind of functionality that AR possesses, which I think really will mean that in the future we won't be working from screens. We will be working in a kind of through these kind of eyewear head-mounted displays, which by the way might be just little more than contact lenses in the future, and where our kind of virtual world is integrated seamlessly with our kind of real world. And I think as you say, head stuff. There's lots of applications that will really benefit.
What you're saying there is important. Let's explore that if we can a little bit more, and then let's look at some of your interests in augmented reality and the research in that area. Maybe what you'd like to see come from it. I'm very conscious again for anybody who's listening to this. Some of you inevitably will have experience with some of this technology or these devices. Some of you won't. Some of you will have somewhere in the middle. Just so people are clear on what we're talking about, I think the principle of it makes sense, this idea of technology supporting and assisting us in some way. What are we actually talking about in terms of devices here? What do we really mean? What's out there and what's coming to some degree? And the other thing is, how does that differ? How can people best understand the difference between augmented reality, virtual reality, and any of these other words that are used? Maybe mixed reality, merged reality is another one that's being used. So maybe just to situate augmented reality a little bit in that space in a way that maybe creates some pictures, and then let's look at some of the applications.
Yeah. So I think like let's just look at the difference between augmented and virtual reality, which is, I mean, these terms are kind of obviously bandied about a lot. Kind of augmented reality is really about kind of having, you're having the virtual overlaid on top of the physical world. So, you're not kind of separated from the physical world when you're in the virtual world. So, by that, for example, think of, you're going to, I don't know, you're going to a bar or something like that, and it's sort of, you have your glasses on and you look up at the front of the bar, and it sort of tells you what beers they serve in the bar, so you don't have to walk into the bar and actually look. You can peruse from kind of outside and speed up your ability to find the right beer you want to find. So it's really about kind of still living in the real world, but having the virtual information there to augment your senses. Right. Whereas virtual reality is kind of being cut off from the real world and fully immersed in a virtual world. So we're kind of, you put on these glasses with these kind of head-mounted displays. Just to give some examples, Oculus, the Oculus Rift, the HTC Vive, Samsung Gear VR. These are things which have essentially like, it's like putting a rectangle on your face, so no one can see your eyes. It's that kind of technology which possibly people are probably a bit more familiar with than AR at the augmented reality at the moment.
And augmented reality at the moment, then, how would you describe the forms that exists in currently? Because there seems to be potential, as you said, like for displays, for this to manifest in a number of different ways.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point as well. So I think the way things are kind of going, as I was saying, I think more and more companies are trying to develop these head-mounted displays. So companies like Meta, who I mentioned, Daiquiri, another one, who have offices in Ireland.
That's right.
For Irish listeners. And then you have Microsoft with their HoloLens, probably one of the most kind of advanced. Some of the most advanced in this kind of area. So, and really, that's kind of putting on kind of some sort of helmet or smart glasses, as it might be called, which have the sort of have a screen which you can see through these. You can see the real world, but then the virtual information is overlaid on top of them. So that's kind of what I mean by head-mounted displays. And then you have, you can have augmented reality through your phones and through your tablets. And I think that's obviously how probably most of us first experience it, certainly how I first experienced it. So you have, various different apps for viewing kind of objects in the real world. So what's commonly done there is an object will have you will put something called a QR code on the object, and that will allow your device to read that, to read, it's basically like a barcode. Yeah. And it sort of can read that barcode or that QR code, and then on the screen, it will then show the physical object, but then the virtual stuff projected on top of that. So just as an example, which you can all kind of go and have a look at, again, Daiquiri have developed some a good kind of it's kind of like a game for viewing chemistry elements. It's called Elements 3D, 4D, Elements 4D, because augmented reality allows you to see. I'll let you read the website for more details on that. But anyway, it's called Elements 4D. You can download it from Google Play, I think.
Yeah, we'll put a link again.
Yeah, great. And it also works on the Mac platform. So it basically kind of you can build these blocks out of paper, and they have the QR codes on them. So they're just squares. Squares. And you can basically point your kind of device, your smartphone, tablet, at these squares which are on a cube, and then it will read those and show you the element. So then you can sort of touch it and interact with it. So it's important to say, I think there's also that element of being able to interact with the kind of virtual objects. So for example, if you look at kind of Meron Grobetz's TED Talk about Meta, he shows how you can physically interact using your hands with the augmented kind of with the virtual object in front of you, which is obviously a powerful kind of means of kind of really allowing you to learn in a much more kind of experiential way, which is important from a psychological
That's what was
point
coming
of
to
view as
mind
well.
for me there, because this interactive sense seems important. And of course, one thing that's happening is this classic virtual reality, augmented reality distinction seems to be slightly breaking down, which is probably a good thing as it becomes more of a sliding scales of degrees of isolation from what we would typically consider the physical environment, which is good. You know, it's interesting. The other thing, when you're talking about smartphones and sometimes even simplistic use of these technologies, even things like Snapchat or these various apps have these sort of fascinating augmentations where they'll change and warp you when you're looking at yourself on the camera.
Yes,
These seem, while simple and playful, they seem very, very important in democratizing these things to some degree and getting people thinking about them and familiar with them and aware of them. Because I've had a chance to try HoloLens briefly. I've been in Daiquiri, but haven't had a chance to see anything. I know they're doing some fairly serious stuff. We obviously understand it's early days with some of this, and we need to be a little bit patient. But at the same time, we don't want to be too patient. We want to kind of get this out to the masses and have a good feedback loop going on, and preferably a lot of people creatively working on projects themselves. Where do you see that going with augmented reality?
Yeah, again, I think it's these are really important questions. I think, you know, it's important to realize, as you said, that augmented reality is probably on a growth curve which is behind virtual reality. So by that I mean, you know, virtual reality, we should start to see these. I think the products are probably going to be on the market. You know, I don't know what the price tag will be, but they should be sort of coming on the market kind of this year. I think, you know, and by that I mean, you know, virtual reality is kind of, you know, gaming and stuff will start to incorporate these things. You know, I think augmented reality is really, at the moment, it really is about kind of helping people in their kind of work, you know, contexts. And I think it might take a bit more time for that to be picked up and actually used for in other kind of areas. However, you know, it certainly is being used. I mean, the best example is probably Pokemon Go at the moment. You know, it's the first really augmented reality game, and obviously that kind of, you know, kind of took the world by storm last year. So I think that really shows you the power of AR, of augmented reality. And I think, you know, just some small facets of that. You know, again, taking people away from just being on their screens. You know, a lot of people. There was a lot of talk about how augmented reality actually got people to walk outside and actually do exercise. You know, I mean, go for walks and go to various places around town to find, you know, to capture their Pokemon that otherwise they'd be sitting at home, kind of, you know, playing the game on their desktop or on their kind of laptop in one place. I think that's really, you know, it's kind of a simple thing, but it's massively powerful. You know, for, you know, say interventions in psychology where you're trying to get people to exercise more who really aren't kind of maybe, you know, into exercise, but you know, you're kind of getting exercise in through the back door.
Absolutely.
There. And I think that's, you know, so there's a lot of, you know, that kind of, I think where games begin, everything else follows. You know, if you can show a game works, then that will kind of allow a space there to be opened up for sort of technologies which kind of utilize it for more kind of serious purposes, in a sense. By serious, I mean kind of in, you know, for example, you know, in psychology, you might want to change behavior using these technologies. Yeah,
hugely beneficial. A lot of interactivity in it, which, as you say, from an experiential learning point of view, is just so crucial. Just customization is very interesting as well, because something we're playing around with at the moment. One of the problems of being a therapist is that when you have a therapy room or a space or a center, you have to be fairly neutral in everything you do, because there's people coming in with all kinds of phobias and, you know, the pictures you put on the walls, the things you have. But of course, that can come at the cost of a warmth. You know, you want to create a nice space as well. So one thing we're playing with at the moment is just that, is having some very simple intake questions as part of the intake process before somebody even comes in, and changing lighting levels, colors, pictures even, adapting to the preferences of the person, so there's a sense of familiarity with the environment before you've even arrived, and equally you're not contraindicating in any way by giving them a picture of a horse when they have a phobia of horses on the wall or something like that. So it seems to be that even in that's a relatively low tech example, in that it's not all about, you know, displays that we're looking through or projection or anything like that. It's about very, very simple existing technologies, but there seems to be kind of clever ways of using that technology that restaurants was the other example you gave, where, you know, according to your dietary preferences, the menu can shift and vary. So you've got this gluten-free menu or this vegetarian menu or this even just preferential menu that's come up as is needed. There seem to be a lot of exciting uses like that kind of, we've had the technology for a while to do that to some degree, but we're not quite using it.
Yeah, and I think it's finding those, you know, key killer use cases. I mean, I don't mean, you know, killer isn't killing you, but the ones that really allow it to take off. So I think Pokemon Go would be in the game sector a great early example. I think hopefully we'll see more, you know, kind of examples in the game sector and other spheres. I think, you know, you have, for example, from a sales point of view, Lego have been kind of an early adopter of augmented reality, because you can allow children, you know, people buying Lego, to see what the Lego creations are once they're built, and people to actually sort of see those in 3D and manipulate it kind of in a sort of I think it's still a screen-based environment, but you know, but it's basically what you do is you take the barcode from the box and put it up to some booth in the I think in the Lego shop, and it sort of scans that and shows you what the thing will look like when it's built, and you can sort of like move it around from different angles and, you know, start to appreciate how the thing you're buying is going to look when it's actually built. You know, and I think, you know, they've obviously adopted that because it's been a useful way of, you know, it increases the ability of it increases the chance that kid will nag their parents to buy that product, which is obviously what they want. You know, sort of
much more engagement.
Yeah, and I think if you're engaging kids with it, you know, there's a sign that it's actually working. You know,
this is always the old-fashioned rule of thumb for salespeople: is have the product in the person's hands as you're selling it, isn't it?
Exactly.
So there's something to that, right? In experiential learning, that this participation builds some sort of connection.
Exactly, and I think that's a good example, because in Lego, you know, you can't have these things always. You can't have every single Lego kit built in store. You know, it's different for maybe when you're selling shoes or something like that, and you can actually sort of manipulate these things. I think there is an element of like you know, kind of the sort of newness of augmented reality, but you know, you have to be kind of mindful of the fact that newness might just become, you know, might just be seen as a hype, and it might just get old quickly for consumers. So I think you know, it needs to be used in the best way possible. I think for, you know, I mean, I'm particularly interested in sort of the work context and how we can use augmented reality to facilitate things like training and learning.
Say a bit more about that, because what I wanted to ask you is, I think you've clarified what it is well. What are you interested in it? Where are you planning on taking your interest in your research with this now?
So I mean, where I'm interested in going is really trying to find those kind of killer use cases in the context of sort of work and training environments where we can use the augmented reality technology to support learning. So I think, you know, there's an interesting idea, again, Meron Gribetz of Meta kind of mentioned this, called, you know, augmented reality provides a zero learning curve. Now, by that, he means that, you know, you put this headset, the head-mounted display on, the glasses on, you go and build your, you know, IKEA furniture. You've never built that piece of furniture before. You've never built any IKEA furniture, and you know, you can do this, you know, very, very easily. You know, or even a more extreme example. You know, you can go and inspect a nuclear power plant and turn the various, you know, and check readings from dials and turn the various pieces of equipment that are needed to sort of make that kind of plant function on a day-to-day basis. And the likes of, you know, people without any training, as long as they had the headgear on, could go and do that. So it's a very powerful idea, because essentially you're sort of saying, well, you're taking the training. You know, you don't need to have training. You just use the augmented reality instructions delivered kind of, you know, virtually through the glasses, tell you exactly what you need to do, and the steps you need to do, and the timing of these steps. So I think, you know, the important kind of element there can be summed up in this sort of ability, in this sort of idea. This, when we sort of do things in work, we have this sort of tacit knowledge of how to do things. Now that's often kind of, you know, these things like the inspection of the power plant is learned over years of, you know, being how to do this. You get kind of a mentor which shows you how to do that. You know, could you use AR to sort of take away the job of the mentor?
Sure.
now I think it's important here to say there's different types of knowledge, and this is where kind of the psychology comes in. So there's the knowledge that Dublin is the capital of Ireland, which you could tell. You can write that down in a piece of paper. You can transfer that to someone else very easily, but it's much harder to transfer the knowledge about how to cook a brilliant meal, for example.
Right. Give
I'll
that a
just
go
wave around again to the camera because the lights have gone off.
By the way, for anybody who's listening to this and not watching the video, just to explain, there's motion sensor activated lights, isn't that what that is? So that's technology being some of that environmental efficiency you were talking about before.
That's right, and it's not. Unfortunately, humans have been cut out the picture there, which is that shows you the problems when
Absolutely, there is a point to be made there.
Yes.
Don't be still. Mindfulness practitioners would suffer in this building.
Yeah, they certainly would. So I was saying about this, the how to cook a great meal, for example. That's okay. We have recipes, but I don't know what your experience, kind of listeners and yourself, John, have. But when I try and recreate a meal from a recipe, it never looks the same as it does on the recipe book. It never looks the same as Jamie Oliver or one of these other star chefs, the way they make it on TV. And I keep telling myself, well, I follow the instructions to the letter, but it's still not the same. And I think this kind of nicely sums up the idea. There's this sort of tacit knowledge of things that people do that impact on what they, for example, what the outcome of the process is, or of the process of cooking a meal. And that's very difficult to capture on pen and paper, but might be a lot more easier to capture on kind of through kind of actually being told in the moment what to do, through kind of instructions delivered through your head-mounted eyewear, for your augmented display.
Well, that's great, because it's this lovely meeting together of action and knowledge, which seems to be one of the things we've been exploring. Isn't it? This meeting together in some very practical way.
Exactly, and I think that kind of from a psychological point of view, it's really it's contextualizing knowledge. And I think that's what augmented reality could do. Absolutely perfectly. Is that could do rather that current technology doesn't allow. And that's really to sort of show what you should be doing at which time, and exactly like how to sort of exactly what ingredient needs to be added into cooking at what time, or what button needs to be pressed at a certain time, and just making that a lot easier for you as well, and taking away that load of that kind of mental load of having to refer back to a recipe all the time when you're cooking, which is kind of what stresses me out when I'm cooking. It's sort of, if it was just delivered in front of me, then it makes that a really smooth process. And for example, applications of that could be in surgery, where you're someone who's doing surgery is showing exactly what they need to do at a certain time. Obviously, I think that example brings up the idea. I wouldn't totally agree with this idea. There's a zero learning curve to AR, because think about surgery. You probably wouldn't want, as I'm a psychologist and I'm a doctor, but you probably wouldn't want me doing, heart surgery on you for good reason. I'm not a medical doctor.
Heart surgery by numbers.
Heart surgery, even if I was told exactly what process, exactly what sort of steps I need to do, even if I had all that knowledge, all that tacit knowledge to hand through augmented reality, I still don't possess the motor skills to actually do that correctly. And I think that's what's good. Psychology really teaches us there's different types of knowledge there. There's this idea of procedural knowledge, this idea of actually how should you manipulate the scalpel, and surgeons often talk about sort of the kind of surgical finesse when they do surgery. So this ability to, we may be going to be interrupted here potentially, but I'll just finish this off.
We're doing this real in the real world.
In the real world, yeah. So the idea of surgical finesse being about how you actually sort of make sure you do the operation properly, and really kind of so you don't kind of hurt. So you make the incisions correctly, and I think that's something which. The good thing about AR is it takes away that kind of knowledge element to some extent. I think can really support certain tasks, but it doesn't replace. It's not like you could just have the man on the street going in to be a heart surgeon.
Sure.
So
from your experience in creativity or augmented reality as being exploring there, is there any key learning or takeaway that really stands out for you from it? Anything you maybe weren't so clear on before you jumped into these topics?
A point of kind of learning. It's a good question.
And not even one thing, but there's even a theme, because obviously before you jumped into these topics and as you are now, is there anything that really has kind of come to the fore for you that maybe you...
So I think the thing that kind of comes to the fore is this idea that technology should be there to take the burden off us, so that we can then do, so that it takes the burden of things which we don't want to do off us, rather than replaces the tasks which we do want to do. So I think that's important. We don't want to replace people doing, manufacturing. We don't want to, take away people's jobs.
Sure.
We want to allow we want to make people's jobs easier. And that's the whole point about technology. It should be doing that rather than replacing people's jobs, and giving us then the space to do more interesting things, maybe more creative things.
Right.
And I think that's where maybe you can link the two. And I think, it's this idea that, I think we do want to put the human at the center of everything so that we don't replace their jobs. But yes, we want to make sure that we don't just, take the human out of the equation.
Most
and
definitely.
I think that applies for anything. And I think, who wouldn't want a little bit less load, when you're cooking the dinner and stuff like that, everyone wants to do that easier sometimes, especially if you've got kids hounding you or something like that, make life easier for us. I think that's what should be our mantra with technology. And, I think augmented reality is a good example of how we can, do that, possibly virtual reality as well.
If people want to find out more about you, keep in touch with some of your research and your work, what's the best way for them to do that?
The best way is you can, go to my kind of website, which is probably best. So if you type Dr. Andrew Pringle into University College Dublin.
Okay, we'll include a link as well.
That's probably the best. I'm also on Twitter as well. I'm not sure how easily I am to find there, but if you type in AJ Pringle UCD, I think you should probably find me there. Again, I'm happy to provide kind of some link so you can follow up. Please do get in touch. I'm always happy to hear from people.
Wonderful. Well, listen, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you very much yourself.
We've explored some fascinating topics, and really what I'd love to do is have you on again some point in the future if you'd be up for it, because
absolutely.
I think this is really happening in real time, a lot of what we're talking about, and it's so important to understand it as it's happening and keep guiding it.
Probably
so thanks for being here.
No problem. Thank you very much.
Talk soon.
Okay.